The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help. Dr. Brian Fiske wasted no time moving from academia to industry. In fact, his academic and industrial pursuits show quite a bit of overlap. His Ph.D. work on cancer metabolism made immediate impact on the clinical development and ultimate commercialization of at least 2 drugs. And judging by the entrepreneurial decisions he's made since then, he seems intent to double down on those wins with a current focus on antibody-drug conjugates. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech, and I'm delighted to bring you Brian Fiske, who now serves as Chief Scientific Officer at Mythic Therapeutics, the company he co-founded in 2016 and one that's currently embarking on a phase 1 study of its lead ADC in non-small cell lung cancer. Dr. Fiske, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you. It's great to see you again. Dr. Fiske and I first met at JPM back in January and made plans to get back together and record an episode on what's going on at Mythic. So here we go. And before we jump into the Mythic story, Dr. Fiske, I want to get some background on that mention that I made about sort of your overlapping academic and industrial pursuits. It's unique, I think. I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of founders and CEOs of small biotechs, and often there's a much more clear line of demarcation between academia and industry. You earned your PhD in biology from MIT in 2015 on the heels of a Harvard undergrad in biochem. But during and prior to that PhD, you're going to clear this up for me. During and prior to that PhD, you gained experience at Bain, Mass Gen, Flagship Pioneering, and Agios. Am I pronouncing that correct? Agios Pharmaceuticals?
Agios
Pharmaceuticals. So tell us about that. Tell us about like what looks to me like this pretty unique combination and overlap of academia and industry.
Absolutely. Well, you started with undergrad, so maybe we'll go there first.
Yeah.
In undergrad, I studied biochemistry, but also did some work in applied math and economics. And I think if you had asked me back then what I wanted to do with my life, it would have varied week to week. And I would have either said, I want to go be a scientist, be a doctor, or do something in business. And I had the opportunity to do an internship after my junior year, ended up at Bain. I ended up going to Bain after undergrad. And I think I chose that direction, at least initially, to go into business, general management consulting, because I wasn't ready to make a decision on those 3 things. And it seemed like the least committal path.
Yeah.
Realized pretty quickly that I wanted to go back. I wanted to go back to school and get my PhD in science and take that route. And as a step on my way there, I spent a year as a lab tech in my former advisor's lab, Dr. David Fisher, who's the head of dermatology at MGH. He's been a fantastic advisor and mentor to me over the years. And left Bain, left my 6-figure job there, and took a giant salary cut to go schlep tissue samples around MGH and make cell lines. And it was fantastic preparation to get my my lab feet under me for a year before going to grad school.
Yeah.
While I was in grad school, I decided to join Matt Vanderheiden's lab. Matt, at the time, it was his first year as a professor, and I was his first student. So maybe that speaks to some entrepreneurial vision. Starting a new lab in academia is not dissimilar to a startup.
Yeah.
And
were you conscious of that when you made that decision and found yourself in that situation? Were you conscious of sort of the entrepreneurial parallel? Or was it just like, hey, this is a cool opportunity, and that acknowledgement came later?
I think so. I think so. I think you have, um, there's an aspect when you go into a new lab, there's an aspect of focus, but also an aspect of flexibility. I mean, in your PhD, you're driving a lot of the work, but I think in a new lab, you have a lot more flexibility and a lot more impact on what the rest of the lab is doing, because you are the lab to start.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels, and I was probably attracted for the same reason that I'm ending up, being a founder at Mythic.
Yep. Yeah. All right. So that lab experience, I think, even along with sort of that entrepreneurial exposure of building out a lab that didn't previously exist, the result of the work you did in that lab also, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm reading this correctly, the work that resulted from that lab work also contributed to, it seems to me, right, the acquisition of the taste for drug development and industry. Is that would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. To be clear, I ended up consulting for Agios. And so Matt was on Agios's SAB, and also contributed to some of the programs there. And I had colleagues who were working on projects that were directly related to Agios. I wasn't working on anything like that, but I had a lot of skills in doing so-called hot experiments, radioactive experiments, and doing mass spectrometry based metabolomics, where I got into some collaborations with Agios and essentially ended up consulting with them for 2 periods. And that was super exciting. That was my first taste of, real entrepreneurship, where when I did my first stint with them, they were 30 people, mostly chemists, working on trying to find a lead drug. And then when I came back a year later, they were 130 scientists. They were in phase 1. They were seeing some fantastic results for really sick patients. And it was so amazing to see, what had been done in only a year, and just got really inspired to do something, get involved with something that looked like that.
Yeah. Yeah. When did I don't want to jump ahead if I got the chronology wrong, but when did Flagship come into the picture?
Sure. So, based on my experience at Agios, and again, thinking, gosh, I really want to do something that looks like that, get involved in some way with something that looks like an Agios and ends up having an impact on patients and building a really exciting company. I started to reach out to my network because it wasn't clear at that time that academia was going to be the right thing for me, the right next step for me. Mm-hmm. So what would it look like to work in biotech? And the advice that I got was, hey, as a junior person, your career is going to be inflected by how well the company does, right? So if you show up at a small biotech and this small biotech does super well, you're going to have a ton of opportunities to grow. If you show up at a small biotech and it fails, that's okay, because you're a junior person and no one's going to blame you for the failure of the biotech, but you're going to have to go somewhere else to get those sort of growth opportunities. And so that immediately brought the question to my mind of, okay, how do I find and start, figure out what a great biotech looks like? And people would give me the answers, well, you should go talk to the CEO, or you should, think about the science and whether, you think it's going to translate into the clinic. And my answer was, gosh, I don't know how to do any of those things. I got really interested in the question, though, of what makes a really great biotech. And that led me to Flagship, because I felt like Flagship was a place where they were creating multiple biotechs in the same place at the same time, and that I would get some experience to try to figure out, what works well and what doesn't work well when you go out and start a biotech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a good sort of petri dish to play with those concepts at Flagship. A lot of opportunity for that. You've mentioned, though, a couple of times so far in this discussion, you've mentioned a couple of points where it sounds like you personally sort of had to pause and think about what you were doing, what you wanted to do next. Like you talked about at Bain, I'm not sure, just whether or not this is where I want to stay, or it took you a while to determine I want to go back to academia. And then you just mentioned, at Agios, or Agios, that is, what's my next step going to be? In those moments, the question I have for you is, like, in those moments of what's next in your mind, Was there ever any sort of anxiety or pressure, or was it a little bit more relaxed? Like, hey, I've got options. Let me think hard about which options I want.
Yeah. To be honest, huge anxiety.
Okay,
and
yeah,
huge pressure, right?
yeah.
Uh, I, I I love my parents, and they've been a fantastic influence in my life, but my parents thought I was crazy for quitting Bain and going to work as a lab tech.
Sure, yeah,
I mean, I was, qualifying for, like poverty related tax credits that year. You know?
but you had, I mean, you had some assurance in your mind anyway that this is part of it's a step toward a greater plan, right? Like,
Exactly, exactly. So I think I've always thought, I tend to think a lot about, what is the right environment for me to make the biggest contribution that I can to something that inspires me, right? Whether that's building, and to me, what inspires me, building a company, and building a company that is able to have a really big impact on patients who are sick.
yeah, yeah. I can imagine. I was there. I have a son who's a freshman in college right now, and I'm just sitting here like empathizing with your parents. Like, we sent you to MIT for that degree so that you could do what? Yes, that's crazy. So Flagship, I want to get back to Flagship. Like I said, like I'm a big fan of Flagship. I've interviewed a ton of their CEOs and founders. And it's interesting, like most of this may be just anecdotal observation. I'm not sure if there's anything to talk about here or not, but most of the founders and or hired guns that I've interviewed that are with Flagship companies now are execs who came from big bio, and the stop at Flagship has been sort of part of their move into emerging. I haven't I haven't had occasion to talk with execs that did time at Flagship, like early in their career, right? Like coming out of the experiences you came out of. Was that unique, like to you, to Flagship? Was that sort of a unique scenario?
Great question. So one thing I would note is that Flagship has changed over time.
Mhm.
I can't speak for Flagship
Sure.
anymore.
Yeah. No. Yeah. We're just John. We're just speculating right now.
There you go. I think Flagship's undergone a ton of growth, and they were growing a lot. And when I was there as well. But no, my role was not unique. I was a associate and then a senior associate, and they had lots of other associates at the time. I think maybe around 10. But I checked a few years later, and they might have had 30 or 40. So they have a lot of folks who are right out of some sort of grad school, usually PhD, who are working now with many of those execs who have been in biopharma, and they're transitioning back to, company creation, who work together to get the companies off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Why did you leave Flagship?
Yeah, so I left Flagship with nothing other than the idea that I wanted to start a biotech independently. So part of it was, I'd had 2 experiences at Flagship, co-founding or working on founding companies, creating companies, and I wanted to seize the challenge to see if I could do that independently. And in my vision for what that looked like, I learned things at Flagship that were, indispensable for founding Mythic, right? Absolutely critical. And that was, so Flagship was an incredible experience for me in that sense. But my vision for what I wanted to build was a little bit different than a Flagship company. I think, at least speaking about the time that I was there, a lot of Flagship companies tend to focus on building a technology first and then thinking about what are the therapeutic applications of that technology. And obviously that's worked out really well sometimes, right? Like Moderna. Thank you, Moderna, for the COVID vaccines. But Moderna was originally, I think, spent a lot of time building a technology, and that enabled them to go and do that. I think what I was most excited about was building a therapeutics focused company from the start, and that being the primary goal. And yes, at it's embodied at Mythic, right? And so at Mythic, yes, we want to use novel technology to make that drug that's going to benefit patients. We know we need to. We want to be doing something different than other companies. But the focus at the end of the day is how do we make the best drug we possibly can for those patients?
Mhm. Yeah. Where did you feel most equipped? And then I'm going to ask, I might as well just throw both parts of the question out now. Where did you feel like most equipped, and where did you feel the least equipped in terms of your body of knowledge, the body of knowledge that would be required to found Mythic?
I would say, one of the changes right off the bat, and it's a very obvious one, you got to be able to bring people on board who are not in the Flagship ecosystem. When you're at Flagship doing company creation, you're bringing in Flagship resources. You're bringing in people who are in the Flagship network. You're bringing in money from the Flagship funds, and you're working with the partners to pitch them and do that. And all of that that whole ecosystem obviously has a focus and a certain set of goals, a certain set of things that they're optimizing for. And it's been very successful, but it's very different from the wider universe, right? It's got its own place in the wider universe. And so I think learning more about how do investors other than Flagship think about investing in a therapeutics company over different rounds, because you want to make sure you have a company that's investable at every single stage. Thinking about, why would somebody join not a Flagship company, but a company that's just, two guys and an idea? And how do you bring that team together and build culture? And so I think maybe I'll end there. I think the most challenging thing over time has been how do you bring together a team and how do you build a culture that allows you to be successful in the way that you want to be successful. And it's not only building that in the first instance, but also nurturing it and not taking any of that for granted. I feel incredibly honored to work with my colleagues. I'm incredibly honored that they came to work at a company that I co-founded. And that's probably been the best part of this whole experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and we'll dig into that here in a minute, but I feel like I might have got ahead of my skis a little bit because I want to hear the origin story. And if you're a listener and you're listening to this point, lest you be misled into thinking like Mythic is just this, tiny little startup. Like Mythic's making great progress in a hurry. I mean, the company has become sizable, well-funded. We'll get into the details, but you've done something from nothing in a relatively short period of time. But before we get any further into that, I want to hear about like the two guys and the idea.
Yeah, let's do it. So I left Flagship. I had a office mate and fellow Flagship associate leave, Alex Nichols, who was my co-founder. And after we both left Flagship, we decided to team up and start something. Mm-hmm. And for the first 9 months, it was two guys around a living room table. Funny enough, Alex ended up moving in right next to me without even knowing it. It was just a complete accident. And so we somehow convinced our wives to let us not have jobs and just go over to each other's place and sit around the living room table thinking about how to start a biotech.
Wow, that's pretty convincing. We'll spend some time offline. Teach me those ways. So here you found yourself with the grace of your wives. Your wives graciously giving you the opportunity to sit around and brainstorm for a few months. Where does that even start? Like, did one of you have a seed in a science, or did one of you have a motivation and a specific indication, or did one of you have some semblance of a target idea? Like, what was the, I guess, nucleus of the conversation? Like, where'd you start?
Right. Well, and maybe going back to Flagship, this is something that Flagship had prepared us well for, right? This stage of, what do you do when you're at zero? And how do you potentially build something on paper and then test, is that going to work or not? I think at a high level, your job as a very early stage entrepreneur who's just starting out is to take bad ideas seriously. And what I mean by that is, before something is a good idea, like a CRISPR or ADCs, for example, usually before that, the reason why it's so popular in the hot new thing is because before that, it was a bad idea. Maybe it was a bad idea because no one thought it would work. Maybe it was a bad idea because no one could do it, right? But it wasn't something, before it was a big thing, it was something that, in a hot new thing, it was something that not a lot of people were thinking about. And so I think what we did a lot of was the process of thinking about things that weren't in favor, but trying to understand why people weren't super excited, why they weren't a hot thing already. And then evaluating, well, how could we be part of and build a company that could be part of changing that? And that's what we found with ADCs. We became fascinated with ADCs. I think even back in 2017, when we started working on ADCs, the clinical results were oftentimes nothing to write home about, but they did show that the drug worked. Oftentimes the typical story would be, let's say, solid tumor indication, 20% response rate, but the responders oftentimes were highly concentrated in these patients that expressed very high levels of the target. So what's going on there? Well, eventually we became very excited about that sort of data because it suggested that if you had a patient who could deliver enough ADC to their own tumor by virtue of very high target expression, then they would respond. Whereas for even intermediate, especially low expressing patients, you couldn't get a response because the antibody component of the ADC wasn't efficient enough at delivering the payload to the tumor. And so with that realization of what was going on, we thought clinically for a lot of different targets, particularly in solid tumors, plus the fact that the antibody side of the ADC equation hadn't really been looked at very much, we got very excited about, hey, here's a field that's a bit out of favor, but by taking a new approach, we might actually unlock something that's holding the entire field back.
Was your co-founder a scientist by training as well?
Yep. So Alex is a PhD as well.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. It's important context because I envision these conversations where you're having you're having an intellectual discussion about a therapeutic area. I don't if he didn't have chops to understand the conversation, it'd be a difficult one to sell. In those early intimate one-to-one conversations, it'd be difficult to I guess create an environment where you're both sort of rallying around the same concept. What were the concerns? Like, to your point, the ADC space was established but not thriving. Like, ADCs have been around for a while, but it certainly wasn't the ADC landscape that we see today back in 2017. So you had a concept that would change the paradigm, change sort of the status quo of what had been happening in the ADC space. But what were I guess maybe red flags? Like, what were some of the concerns that needed to be overcome?
Right.
To put your stake in the ground and say, yeah, you know what? Like, let's go try to chase this thing down.
Sure. I think there's a general red flag when you're pursuing maybe a contrarian idea, in that you're going to have to tell your story in order to make people get it, instead of people coming to you and saying, oh, you're an ADC company and it's 5 years later. And of course I would join an ADC company. Of course I would invest in an ADC company. So I think generally that's something that we had to overcome.
Were you conscious of that from the outset? Like, where, as you discussed this, the concept, where you're like, yeah, but boy, I don't know how warm the VC community is going to be if we just pop up and say, hey, these ADCs that people have been struggling with for so long, we think we got to figure it out. Give us some money.
Yeah, there's a great story that our lead investor, Brian Roberts of Venrock, tells, that when he first did diligence on us for the Series A, he called up, his oncology experts, and they said, ADCs, why are you doing something in ADCs, Brian? This doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You should go do cell therapy, go do something else. So it's those sort of reactions, but I think people like Brian were actually able to willing to listen to what we had to say, which, I'm especially appreciative of because we're not the 50-year biopharma veterans coming and saying this is the next thing. We're the, guys who spent 2 years at Flagship coming to tell you, we were in the living room and we thought that this would be a good idea, and maybe a little bit of evidence that goes along with that. But yeah, it is something to overcome. On the other hand, I think we're taking such a different approach at Mythic. I still feel like we have, convincing to do. I think the ADCs are hot right now, so we're kind of in that category, but we're not a linker payload company. And when I think people think of an ADC company, I actually think they're really thinking of a linker payload company. And so I still think we haven't quite hit our hot moment yet.
So unpack that a little bit, like compare and contrast Mythic to I guess assumed linker payload company, like the company that everyone just assumes when they think ADC. Like what's different about you?
Right. So maybe as I started to introduce beforehand in this conversation, we focus on the antibody component of the ADC rather than the linker payload component. And we design antibodies that can deliver more of that payload really to cancer cells where you want it, and less payload to normal cells where you don't want it.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Whereas a lot of, like, I was just looking at some ADC companies this morning in preparation for a project we're working on that's gonna show up a little bit later in the year, and I found that many of them, like, that their antibodies are coming in from an outsourced provider. Like, so you're saying, like, you're doing that antibody development in-house. What is the linker technology then outsourced at Mythic?
Yeah. So for our first program, we're using VCMMAE, which is a well-known linker payload. Our platform is fundamentally agnostic, right? So we've shown our technology works with VCMMAE. We've shown it works with topoisomerase inhibitor payloads. We've shown it works with DNA toxins. So regardless of what we attach to the antibody, it will deliver more. And you're right, though, in that I think the reason why no one is really focused on the antibody up to this point, other than Mythic, is because some of the challenges behind the linker payload historically were so difficult to overcome. And I think having overcome some of those challenges is why the ADC field is experiencing so much success right now. But the question is, what's the next generation? What's going to solve the problems that we have now, not the problems that we had 20 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. What are the problems now? Like, the problems 20 years ago, I think we could reflect on that: toxicity and payload and trying to get the equation right, So assuming that we've gotten to a point where that has been figured out, what challenges do you face now? Like, what are the problems now?
Yeah. So one of the most inspiring visions for the field, and it's not necessarily my vision, but I will ascribe to it, is that ADC should replace chemo, right? Because they're more efficacy, less toxicity. Just the word chemo, we try to avoid even using the word chemo in association with what we're doing with ADCs, although many of the payloads, technically they are chemo. Just the word chemo makes you think of, maybe someone who has cancer, who has the potential to get better, but it's not going to be a fun experience, right?
Right.
So I think that's one of the most inspiring visions. But if we're actually going to do that, and we're actually going to replace chemo with ADCs, we're going to have to get ADCs to work for broad segments of patients and many different targets. And right now we're in a place where, at least in solid tumors, ADCs work really well for targets that are very highly expressed. So HER2 in breast cancer and a couple of other cancers, Nectin-4 in bladder cancer. These are very highly expressed targets. But where ADCs don't work currently are lower expressed targets, and specifically patients who have a target, but it isn't expressed at those super high levels. And so being able to treat patients with intermediate levels of expression, low levels of expression, being able to look at targets that don't have, hundreds of thousands of copies per cell, like a HER2 or a Nectin-4, and being able to look at patients who are inherently resistant to the payload, that's really what's going to allow us to replace chemo.
Yeah. And when you, so back up a few years, when you were, you gave a great example of Brian, one of your lead investors, jumping on board. When you were out there trying to raise that Series A and in subsequent fundraising efforts, I'm curious about what were the keys to winning that favor in a market that, especially in those early days, was, I don't want to say frowned upon. That might be too strong, but certainly not in favor. So what was it sort of your vision for where ADCs go next, and the way that you would go about putting them together? Indications like, what were some of the keys to getting winning that favor of the VC community?
I think telling a big story really well and very clearly and succinctly, and then not giving up. Just trying over and over and over again in the face of failure. So I think I've probably been in 500 investor conversations, like distinct investor conversations at this point. Yeah. And only a handful of those were ever yeses.
Yeah. Did you, this is totally out of left field, just curious though, because you're young and because your co-founder was young as well. Like when you guys, you're still young. I don't want to age you, but in 2016, 2017, like, a couple of years experience coming out of your PhD program. Did you experience any, I don't know if you'd call it, would it be called ageism? If people like, I don't know, you're out there doing the circuit, trying to raise some money to get a company started. And, did you ever get any perception from some of the VCs that like, who's this kid? Like, what's he looking to do? Go around the block a few times and then come back and see me.
Yeah, well, during that process, we definitely went around the block many different times.
Yeah.
I like how you frame that maybe I'm a little older now. I certainly have a few more gray hairs.
Oh, well, yeah. The business will do that to you.
It will. Look, I don't know. I can't say. I can imagine, different places it maybe have gone different ways. Maybe people were excited that young folks with our background were trying to do something new, and maybe it made them listen and pay attention to what we were doing more. But I'm very thankful for having found people like Brian, like Kareem Helmy at Viking, who's one of our other lead investors, Dan Farrow at Omics, Josh Koppelman at First Round, to start it all off in our seed round, who were willing to listen to what we had to say. And I would also say, a big moment for Mythic was when we raised our angel round. And so it wasn't just me and Alex, it was me and Alex and a group of angels who, for some unknown reason, well, hopefully for good reasons, that they saw something here that they wanted to invest in Mythic instead of doing anything else they could have done with that money. And so during our angel round, we raised about $750,000 in summer of 2017. And that was about 9 different C-level biotech execs. Yeah. And so at that point, again, it wasn't just us, it was us plus these, we're borrowing the credibility and advice of our angel investors in order to, grow and move forward.
Yep. Yeah. So tell us about what you're putting the money that you've raised today toward. Tell us a little bit about the clinical program, you tell me where you want to start. You talked about how Flagship sort of takes this approach generally around let's build a platform or a technology and then figure out what we do with it from a therapeutic standpoint. You kind of took the opposite route, yet you've landed on, you've got a platform, right? I mean, the company has a platform now. So I guess tell us a little bit about the build out of that and what it's producing and yeah, the brick and mortar that's put together as a result of your investment success.
Sure. So we have built a platform. We've gone very broad with our platform. So we've applied this engineering on the antibody side that allows us to deliver more payload to cancer cells and less to normal cells across about 20 different targets. We inserted our engineering into over 100 different clinical stage ADC antibodies, and we're on candidate number, I think, 16,000 at this point.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
we've done this a lot, and we built a platform and a team that's very good at doing this very quickly. Out of that effort, right? Because I think what we saw was a potential for this type of engineering to result in a therapeutic that would have an impact on these lower expressing, less sensitive patients. We very quickly found where that technology worked really well. And one of those was MET, which is the target of our lead drug. We also found where it didn't work. And I think that's part of, in my vision at least, even if you want to make, just are interested in making the drug, if you have some sort of an insight on how to do that, you're never going to avoid a messy car accident between your technology and target biology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some things science allows them to work, some things it doesn't. And so we went very broad, very early to try to figure that out. Where was it working the easiest, the quickest, the fastest, the best? And so that was MET, at least initially. And so our lead ADC is ADC targeted against MET. It's currently in a phase 1 dose escalation, dose expansion trial as monotherapy in non-small cell lung cancer. And we're nearing the tail end of the dose escalation portion. We're working with a number of sites, and I'm just incredibly grateful to the sites and the patients who have been on this journey with us so far.
Yeah. How big is the company now? I mentioned that your growth was pretty rapid. I mean, once things got rolling, I mean, you've got a pretty sizable outfit now. So how many employees are with Mythic?
So we're at about 40 right now. I'm at our world headquarters here in Waltham.
Yeah. Very nice.
Just one location to date.
Yeah. What are the, intentions? I mean, obviously it's early, you're in phase 1, but what are the intentions longer term? And this is the question that I always love to ask because, I can always sort of gauge like just how transparent a founder or CEO is in their response to this question. Like, well, you know what? Our intentions are to, build a molecule that is ripe for acquisition, or build a molecule that we can take to a certain point and actively sell or partner, or we want to take this thing to the finish line. We want to build a full service biopharmaceutical company that works in a specific area of indications. And with the caveat that opportunity presents itself and those plans can all change. So I never I'm not holding anyone to anything, but like, this is your first go at founding a company around a molecule and an idea that you and your co-founder, kind of put together on your own. There's got to be a strong sense of ownership, right? Around what you're doing. I'm sure you've put a lot of time, money, and intellect into it. What would you like to see happen? Like, let's put it that way. Like, what would you like to see happen with this company? Where would you like to take the company?
I'd like to cure some patients, or at least make some patients feel a lot better. And it's exciting to be in clinic and doing some of that right now. But obviously, we have to go through a number of stages of development before we have an even bigger impact. And so, where I would want to go with the company is building an enduring multi-product oncology company.
Good.
We've done a lot of engineering, like I talked about, and we've seen the impact that this sort of an approach can have. We started out with, so-called pH engineering to accomplish this effect of more delivery to tumor cells and less delivery to normal cells. But we have subsequent generations of different types of engineering that we can also achieve the same effect and combine it with pH engineering. And so it's great to have a lead program, but we're building a pipeline behind that. We have a second program, which will come to start IND enabling work this year for a potential IND file at the end of next year. And so building an enduring multi-product oncology company that can have the full impact of what we've discovered with our technology and our approach.
Yeah. That technology, the discovery, I mean, you mentioned, 16,000 iterations, right now, one clinical candidate. Someone who isn't like intimately familiar with the way that this business works and discovery works would look at it and go, if I made 16,000 widgets today and none of them were quite right and walked out with one, that'd be a pretty frustrating experience. And this is going to lead back to, I mean, and obviously most of our audience understands how this business works. But at the same time, you build an organization, 40 people now, 40 people and growing, plus partners and, manufacturing partners. And you mentioned this earlier, the culture at Mythic, the team and sort of the mission. It can be a frustrating industry to work in if you don't embrace those odds and that, quote unquote failure rate. So share with me a little bit about that. It's a young company led by young people. You've built this organization. It's a tough business to be in. What does Brian Fiske do to build and maintain a culture of, positivity and momentum and excitement about what you guys are doing there?
So first off, it's the amount of work required to do, numbers 1 through 15,999 is far less than the work that's required to take one into clinic. And so I guess that's the first thing that I would say. We're fortunate to have been able to build a platform where it doesn't cost us much to do multiple cycles of iteration with hundreds and hundreds of candidates, thousands of candidates on any given program. And we keep a very high bar for what we take into clinic. Essentially, it's got to be best in class. It's got to be treating some very sick patients, of whom there are a lot of them, in order for us to get motivated to bring something into clinic. And I think that's very motivating for people. One of the, and maybe I talked about it before in general terms, but one of our core values at Mythic is what we call patient-centered science, in that we get really excited about science that's going to have an impact in patients, and letting that impact in patients lead, like what that drug looks like and the effect it's going to have, lead us to what sort of technologies would we have to do in order to accomplish that, rather than the other way around. Yeah. And I think that's been very motivating to a lot of folks. A lot of folks have come to us, come to work with us from other companies where maybe they had a really exciting technology, but it never really translated into a drug that had an impact on patients. And so, that's not everybody. Some people like to work on technology. Some people like to, do other things, but that's the folks that we've attracted at Mythic. And so keeping that really high bar, being really sure that we are giving ourselves the best shot possible to have something that could really impact patients. When we make that decision to put something into IND-enabling studies, that's been a core part of who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. I mentioned you mentioned 40 employees. I said 40 employees and growing. That growth was recently marked by the addition of a new CEO. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, what went into the determination that you needed a new CEO? Was there any, was there sort of an inflection point around that hire? And tell me about the hire itself.
Sure. So we're incredibly excited to be working with George. So George Eliadis joined us from Jazz. He was formerly Chief Transformation Officer and Head of Business Development at Jazz. Brings a ton of experience in commercial launch, M&A, product strategy, etc. So I think he's the right CEO to take what we have, which is some interesting proof of concept and a platform, and scale that into multi-product enduring oncology company. And yes, maybe I said he'll be doing that. He'll be leading the team to do that.
Yeah, definitely leading the team. I mean, this is interesting to me as well. Like, you're the chief scientific officer. Chief Science Officer. Scientific or science?
Scientific.
Scientific. Okay. And I don't know if there's if there's anything different between those two words, if it's just semantics. But you're the founder and chief scientific officer. What kind of goes into the thinking around that? You got two founders, say, okay, we're going to form up a company. Like, you just hired a CEO who you think is going to be equipped probably better than you, to go do those, building oriented things. What goes into the thinking around, like, who's going to take what role when you found a company with a scientific background like yours?
In my thinking, it's really about, so to be clear, my co-founder, Alex, was CEO for a period of time and then transitioned out of the company about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had that as sort of an open role. And then we had a search open, and then, ended up hiring George, who we're fantastically excited about because he's really the right person.
Yeah.
In terms of picking roles from the get-go, we didn't have roles for the first year or two. We were just co-founders. And then I think in my thinking about how you pick roles, again, I would go back to something I said earlier, which is, what's the role from which I can have the most impact on what we're doing? And for me, that was the science. I had a background in oncology from my PhD. I felt like it was something I was uniquely strong at. And Alex had his own set of strengths that, we ended up deciding he would go be CEO. So,
yeah. I was just curious, when you're forming things up, it's interesting, who's going to play what role. George, you said, is he right there in your world headquarters with you? You guys kind of in lockstep right now, like on the daily?
He is, yeah. So he's been here for 2 weeks, and then this week he's in SF packing up and moving.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. It was a 2-year period between Alex's departure and bringing George on.
Mm-hmm.
Was that an active search the entire 2 years?
Yes.
And how did you go about, like, what were sort of the strategy and the keys to landing the right person?
I think looking for someone who was going to be the right kind of leader to lead the culture that we have and that we want to build. And then someone, maybe very secondarily to that, who had a set of skill sets that was complementary to our existing executive team. So we haven't talked about them yet, or as much, but Sander, who's our chief operating officer, also does the COO thing, but also runs manufacturing for us, had an incredible career in that, and very, very skilled. And then Gilles Gallant, who's our chief development officer, comes to us from Daiichi Sankyo. Daiichi is the company that created Enhertu, which probably kicked off the current ADC craze, as it were.
Yeah.
And Gilles was actually the program lead for Enhertu. So, that went well. And then he was promoted to head all of oncology clinical development at Daiichi, and then came to work with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Building an all-star team. My frequent guest, Alan Shaw, says, investors don't bet on horses, they bet on jockeys. And it sounds like you put a pretty good team of jockeys together there at Mythic.
Absolutely.
What's next? Who's next on your, I shouldn't say who, don't name names, but what role is next on Mythic's, hit list in terms of executive development, or, for that matter, even scientific advance? Like, who do you need?
I think we have a pretty complete team right now. We are a private company. I would bet that at some point, we're already starting to think what it would take to become a public company. I don't think we're committed towards that path at all, but it's something you got to think about ahead of time. The thing that comes to mind is maybe there's a chief financial officer in the works if we decide to go down the public company route. But, right now Sander's running finance and doing quite well at that. So no immediate need there. And I think we're going to focus on onboarding George, working with him to figure out next steps in the next few months, and then build and grow from there.
Yeah. Any any big next steps or inflection points on the horizon for the company on the whole? Obviously, this trial is probably keeping you pretty busy right now.
Yeah, it's an incredibly exciting time at Mythic. So we're wrapping up the dose escalation phase of our trial. It was done in unselected patients, which we know is not our patient population, but we learned a lot of things about safety, about PK, about dose, and some early signs of efficacy. We were also able to go fast. I mean, that was why we chose to go unselected to begin with, was to go fast, and we've achieved that. We've had incredible enrollment up to this point. And that's also a credit to the investigators and patients. Very thankful for them. And so there's that whole package of data that'll come together this year. There's also the package of data that we're going to use to motivate starting IND enabling work for our program too. So I'm incredibly excited about that and what we're doing with program 2. And so from a data perspective, it's a good time to think about another financing. And with that financing, focus on getting into the dose expansion portion of our trial, funding a path to pivotal for the lead program, and then bringing that second program to IND.
Yeah. I'm assuming you've shared all that you're willing to share or can share about that second program?
For now, yes.
Okay. All right. I figured, but I had to ask.
Of course.
What haven't I asked you that I should have if I were a better interview, Brian?
It's been a fantastic interview. I think, maybe the message I would leave with, or that I would focus on is, again, we're a very different type of ADC company, focused on the antibody component. We're not a linker payload company. But we're hoping to stand on the shoulders of what's been done and what will be done on the linker payload side to have this very unique ability to deliver more to tumors and get a broader set of patients to respond, so that we can replace chemo with something safer and with something more effective.
Yeah. All right. So I lied. I have one more question for you. Maybe I didn't lie. I don't think I said that was my last question, but you just brought up you brought up this point. We alluded to it earlier, the fact that like the ADC space has sort of exploded in recent months, if not like, a short number of years. It's only recently just kind of blown up. And because you just made sort of your final statement around, reiterating this idea that Mythic is a different ADC company with a different approach. What is your take on sort of the crowded landscape and cacophony of noise in the ADC space that's happening at this, very, very moment? What's your take on it? Like, is it good for Mythic in the industry? Is it challenging to be heard and noticed and seen and differentiated? Is there a bunch of noise out there that needs to be culled? Like, what are your general thoughts?
So I see two different things going on. One thing that's going on is for ADCs that have positive clinical proof of concept data, there are a lot of deals happening, and they're big deals. It's hard to find a deal that looks like that is less than $1 billion up front.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because ADCs can address large indications, and they're highly manufacturable at this point, right? They're not a bespoke manufacturing process like, cell and gene therapy, for example.
Yeah.
The other thing that's going on is more in the preclinical space, where there is a lot of, I don't know if to call it noise, but a lot of activity. But there, in the preclinical space, it's hard to find a deal with an upfront greater than about $50 million. The other piece, and thing that you have to think of is, with like a cell and gene therapy, particularly, let's say cell therapy, when those deals were happening, in the last 5 years, very few larger companies could do cell therapy, right? And so they were looking for partners to bring in that as an expertise. Mm-hmm. With something like an ADC, pharmas can do ADCs, right? They can make an ADC, they can make antibodies, and they can conjugate it to a payload. And so you have to bring something different, or you have to bring clinical data to the table. And I think that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to bring both. But I think that the preclinical space which is very frothy, is inherently capped. We're looking to sort of put that aside and take things to clinical POC where we can generate that hugely value inflecting data set.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. I like that response. Thorough, honest assessment of the space and your role in it. Yeah, we got to wrap things up here. I've been abusing your time, Brian, but it's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us and giving us an update on Mythic. And, we'll be paying attention. I hope to have you back on the show, maybe once you've got some more data coming in from the clinical trial, maybe when you can share a little bit more on your second program. Because it's an exciting space, and your approach and the uniqueness of your approach is it's great fodder for the conversation. So thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. And we look forward to doing it again.
Thanks, Matt. I enjoyed that.
All right. So that's Mythic Therapeutics co-founder and chief scientific officer, Dr. Brian Fiske. I'm Matt Pillar. You're listening to the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Life Science Connect and available to hear anywhere you listen to podcasts, and available to watch at bioprocessonline.com under the Listen and Watch tab. Subscribe to our newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. And in the meantime, thanks for listening.